All right, here we go. Hey, folks, how are you? Today, brought to you by the Science and Entertainment Exchange, we're going to be talking to the wonderful Dr. Larry Brilliant. Look at you folks, already here. This is brought to you by the National Academy of Sciences. The Science and Entertainment Exchange is a program that connects entertainment writers to science experts. I have been on the advisory board since 2008. It's how I met Neil deGrasse Tyson and Ann Druyan, and then went on to make Cosmos. So, if I can figure out how the hell this works, we're going to be talking to Dr. Larry Brilliant. Let's see here. What can I tell you about Dr. Brilliant? He's a medical officer in the World Health Organization, was a medical officer in the World Health Organization's smallpox eradication program that certified the global eradication of smallpox in 1980. It is the only disease in history ever to have been eradicated by human effort. He has been a professor of international health at the University of Michigan. From 2006 to 2009, he was executive director of Google.org, the philanthropic arm of Google. He has devoted his life to fighting the specter of pandemics, and as someone who has been in the thick of one of the worst global pandemics in history and beat it, his insight into what's happening now is unique and valuable. So we're going to chat for an hour or so until my cat knocks my iPad over, one or the other. We will talk about the facts and myths surrounding the virus, the vaccines. We will examine why America leads the world in coronavirus cases and what other countries can do to catch up. So without further ado, let's see if I can figure this out.
There you go.
Oh, look at that.
Isn't technology grand?
It's really, that should not have taken me that long. That was just a disgrace. How are you doing?
Like everybody else, I'm in the middle of a pandemic.
Yeah, this tends to happen. So let's get right to this. So you were a key player in the successful eradication of one of the most deadly epidemics in history, smallpox, of course. I want you to do most of the talking here. I think you're the one people want to hear from. Are there any macro lessons that you think that the world should be taking from that earlier crisis that you dealt with that apply here? And how would you compare the planet's collective perspective toward that disease to the one that we're seeing now?
Well, actually, I was a child at that time. I was just a young hippie, straight off of a hippie bus, living in a monastery, and sort of had forgotten I was a doctor until I was sent to go work for the World Health Organization. So I think it was fair to say that I was the mascot on the team, the bat boy, whatever we did. And I stayed for 10 years, so I got to watch people who really knew a lot about eradicating diseases and had given their life. And I got hooked on epidemiology by watching the last case of smallpox, seeing it disappear. There's a lot to learn from it, although these are very, very different diseases. So first of all, smallpox killed 500 million people in the 20th century. That's not a wordo. So 500 million people died from smallpox in the 20th century, which was only 22 years ago or something like that. And it was a terrible disease. 1 out of every 3 people who got it died, mostly children. And we had a great vaccine. But we had that vaccine for almost 200 years, 170 years, before we were able to use it and do a global vaccination program. So that's the first lesson. When you get a vaccine, you don't immediately get rainbows and unicorns. You have to build a global program. And I think the most important lesson for where we are today is that it took people who were black and white and brown and every color of the rainbow, who were every religion and who came from 100 different countries, to work together and to decide that it was more important to bury their differences or to work together than it was to fight. Even then the Soviet Union and we then the United States, with 20,000 nuclear tipped missiles aimed at each other, decided it was more important to work together to conquer smallpox than it was to fight. And I think this is a different time, Seth. The 70s and the 80s was still close enough to the Second World War that people had learned the importance of global organizations like WHO, the United Nations, and we were each willing to give up a tiny bit of our sovereignty, I guess, if that's the right word, in order to conquer global problems. I hope that becomes true again, but right now we're having some problems with that.
Well, it's interesting you bring that up because obviously this has been going on for over a year, but well, it depends on what country you're living in. For us, it's been almost a year. And we're still seeing a whole lot of cases of coronavirus. As you just pointed out, it could be argued that we, particularly in this country, are particularly unable to adapt to the temporary curtailing of freedoms that may be necessary to protect the health and lives of the community. And I'm not talking about big stuff. I'm talking about just being asked to wear a mask. We as Americans take individualism to a pathological extreme. What is the current state of the epidemic globally, and are we treating it differently than the rest of the world?
Well, we're treating it different than some parts of the world. We're over 100 million cases in the world, over 2 million deaths worldwide. That makes this the worst epidemic, the worst pandemic, certainly since 1918. And in some ways it's worse, in some ways it's not as bad. It's unlikely that the virus is going to stop until we have hundreds of millions of people who are affected by it and tens of millions who die the way it's going now. But it's a Dickensian moment, I guess. It's the best of times and the worst of times. It's also a tale of two countries, two cities, two different responses. If you were in Vietnam or Taiwan or South Korea right now, or New Zealand or Iceland, you'd be looking at us and saying, what happened to my friends? What happened to the Americans I love? What happened to the people that I respected so much? They're always so good at everything. They helped us get rid of Ebola. They helped us eradicate smallpox and polio. How did they get into such a horrible fix? You started off by saying, we lead the world in coronaviruses. We want to teach the world how to catch up. Why do we lead the world in coronavirus cases? And why at 4 or 5% of the world's population do we have a quarter of all the world's deaths? That's not what I think of as America. And we've fumbled the ball pretty badly. And so the other parts of the world, like Vietnam and South Korea, before a vaccine, were able to get down to 0 cases for hundreds of days. We have a lot to learn. But there are countries worse than us too. We shouldn't forget that.
Do you think should we be having more lockdowns? Should we have at one point had that one big committed lockdown that kind of got us out of the woods? We never really did. Would we be in the situation now if we had been there, if we had acknowledged that and acted upon it at the right time?
It isn't the lockdown per se. Nobody in public health wants a lockdown. It's not a lockdown per se that gets you out of this problem. The lockdown, and I think you only get one shot at a nationwide full-on lockdown for a month, which we didn't do.
Yeah.
But a lockdown like that just allows you to kind of reset the game board. It allows you to go back to 0 and then do the things you need to do. Before you have a vaccine, you need to find every case and test and trace and isolate every case. And you need to wear face masks. You need to keep socially distant. You need to practice good hygiene. You need to stay away from some places, like indoors, dark, crowded places where you want to get close and exchange air, and go to other places like the great outdoors where you can walk around without masks if you're the only person walking. We missed our chance. I don't think we get a second chance at that. We have to do it a little differently now, much more selectively.
Now, are all masks the same, or do some masks do the trick better than others?
Yeah, no, all masks are not created equally. The bandana mask that's kind of, or the baklava, one ply mask that you can breathe out of easily and you'd like to use instead because it's easy to breathe and it's cool. Those are the worst. 2-ply, 3-ply gets better and better. The holes in a mask or in a cloth, if you lay them over each other like a stack of Swiss cheese, you cover up the holes. So the more ply, the better. And in particular, it's these masks that have almost no holes, that are made by melting plastic. And those are the N95 and the KN95 masks. Those are far superior. Surgical masks that are 5-ply, those are the next rung. And after that, it's kind of do it yourself. Put on mask after mask, double or triple mask. But if you can get a KN95 mask, that's the one that I recommend. But there are some fake ones out there, so you have to be careful.
Yeah. So obviously, we live in a fact fluid time. There are a lot of conspiracy theories out there. When people say, like, because I'm sure there's a few of these folks watching right now. When people say, I think the numbers are inflated, or doctors are classifying cases that aren't COVID, or for financial reasons, or it's a hoax, there's a 98% survival rate. Can you speak to these people, and are there some particularly widespread misconceptions about COVID that continue to kind of bubble to the surface?
Well, a lot of things you said are quite true. There's more than a 98% survival rate. But that's not such a good number. If 100 million people have it, that would mean 2 million people dying. That's not, it's just the numbers aren't in your favor if it's a 98% survival rate. And it's true that in some cases, the numbers are inflated. In more cases, they're deflated. It's hard to keep track of a disease like COVID. We've never done a really good job of keeping score of influenza. We did a great job keeping score of smallpox. It was easier. You could see every case that had the disease on people's faces. COVID has this unusual combination of ease of transmissibility and just the right amount of morbidity and mortality to scare us. But with so many asymptomatics, and many, many people just don't get a very bad part of this disease, and many, many people die from it. So it's a hard combination. So what I'd say to people who think that there's a lot of misinformation is that you're right. Choose your sources carefully. I'd recommend places like the Johns Hopkins website. Excuse me. Now that we're getting CDC back online, there was something wrong with the electricity. CDC was offline for a few years there. The CDC data is always impeccable, except maybe the last 4 years. But you can trust CDC when it's working well. Also, for those in California, I've been very impressed with the LA Times COVID tracker. I like COVID near you. I like the COVID tracker. I like many of these COVID projects. I like COVID-ly. There are a lot of really good sources to get good data.
So you'll occasionally hear of folks having gatherings at their homes, whether inside or outside. I'm going to get to that in a minute. And they'll say, it's okay, we all got tested at the door. Or we my family was here, but we've all been tested. Again, like masks, are all tests the same? Obviously, there's the rapid tests, there's the antigen tests, there are the PCR tests. What does all that mean for people who are new to it?
Well, first of all, sorry about that. I should say that's not COVID, by the way. If an epidemiologist coughs, you have to do full disclosure. If not, we're really lucky that we have tests that we're using in this way. These tests that we're using, these diagnostic tests, these point of care diagnostics, we're not using them the way that they were intended. We have a novel way of using them. These tests, like the PCR test, it was designed in order to help a doctor or a hospital confirm a diagnosis that they suspected. Did you think this was rabies? Did you think that it was smallpox? Did you think it was COVID? It wasn't intended to be used for testing large numbers of people who are asymptomatic. And that's true for the antigen test too. Of the two, these PCR tests work much, much better in dealing with people who may or may not be infected. The antigen tests, some of them, there's 200 of them, and many of them are bad. Some of them are quite good. They're only really good for people who have already got the disease, they're on day 5 or later, and you're trying to confirm it. But the PCR test is better because it's got 4 targets. So you're trying to multiply the amount of virus material you have so that you can see it. It's like a magnifying glass. You're increasing the magnification. And it's got 4 targets. One is just a housekeeping target to say you've got enough snot or enough spit, enough saliva to really know you've got a good sample. And then you're looking for 3 molecular targets. And so you've got a better chance of getting it right than these antigen tests that have only 1 target. And they're about, these PCR tests are about 97, 98, 99% sensitive, 99% specific. Really accurate. They just take a little longer and they're expensive. So what we'd like to do is to combine the accuracy of the PCR test with the speed of the antigen test. And whether it's an antigen test or a LAMP test or whether it's a CRISPR test, these other names for it, or even a rapid PCR test, we'll get there. We'll get there probably in the next 3 or 4 months. Everybody wants the same thing. We want a 5-minute, $5, 100% accurate test that you can take with saliva and not with a brain tickler at home and get it, and then go out and decide if you're going to, go to that place you're talking about, that party. And I think we're 3 or 4 months away from having that in inadequate quantities. And I would say one other thing. The world is going to look a lot more normal because of having tests like that, even than it will with the vaccine. The vaccine is more important to stop the outbreak. But, you're not going to go to Ibecia or to, Coachella unless you've got a series of rapid, quick, inexpensive, accurate tests. Mm-hmm. And hopefully we'll get there by the summer.
And okay, now you did a podcast at one point that I listened to, and it was actually kind of fun. I think there's a few of these we can do here. You guys did a segment called "How Safe Is It?" And it's interesting because that's for the layman that is kind of a question that comes up a lot. Is it safe if I do this? Is it safe if I do that? Take something like going to the beach. Going to the beach, is that safe?
Oh, all alone, go swimming. That's really safe, except for the sharks.
Yeah. Okay. So that's go to the beach alone. Eating at a restaurant. Now I know this is a gray area. So, there's a thought that, well, we were outside, we're fine.
I have seen some outsides that look more like inside. Mm-hmm. In fact, we have one here in Mill Valley that has plastic all around all 4 sides and a roof and has a plastic door, but you can see through it and it's labeled outside. That's not helpful. But if you're outside and it looks like a picnic and there's a good breeze and people are still, 6 feet away or something like that, and you're wearing a mask, but you take it off to eat or drink, that's perfectly safe. Mm-hmm. in almost any circumstance. Now, I'd like to put an asterisk on that because we've got these variants, these mutations. We don't yet know about how transmissible they're going to be in real life. So let me have that asterisk and come back to it. But right now, I feel safe going to an outdoor restaurant on a breezy day when I'm still practicing, safe living.
Right. Unless you're sitting across from Tom Hanks, then you're in trouble.
Most of the time you're okay. It's just in those 4 days that he was infectious that you need to worry. It's just
yes. So okay. So let's talk a little bit about vaccines. Obviously, we just had this disaster situation at Dodger Stadium, this insanity where you had people blocking the vaccination site, which is about the craziest thing I think I've ever heard in certainly in 2021. People are still asking, are you going to get the vaccine? And just the fact that question is asked in the middle of a pandemic, this devastating, shows that we still have a long way to go in fighting vaccine hesitancy. The misinformation about flu shots alone for years has just driven me mad. How does the vaccine work, and is it safe?
Well, so full disclosure, I had my first vaccination
Congratulations.
2 weeks ago. I had the Moderna mRNA vaccine. I refused to jump in front of the line. I waited until I was called. I was never called. My wife was called. And as a good husband, I accompanied her to her vaccination. And I was just sitting there kind of, looking at my iPhone. And the nurse came up to me and said, "When is your appointment?" I said, "I don't have one." And she said, "Oh, we have an open spot." That's what everybody wants to have happen. So we're really, I like to say the virus moves at exponential speed, but so has science. I've never heard of a vaccine being developed inside of a year. And not only that, but you have hundreds of millions of doses in less than a year since this virus began. I said earlier, it took 170 years before we could use the smallpox vaccine to eradicate it. It took 70 years after we had the polio vaccine before we could figure out how to do a campaign. The fastest vaccine to be produced before on record is the mumps vaccine. That took 4 years. So this Operation Warp Speed, whatever you may think of the previous administration, is wonderful. And it got us some great vaccinations really quickly. We didn't do so good, though, on the program to deploy them, but we've got great vaccines. So let's just start off with the first two, Pfizer and Moderna. These are mRNA vaccines. They're a brand new science. They're more like computer code wrapped inside of the fat of the virus. And that instructional set is what is injected into your arm. Now that means you're not going to be able to get COVID from the vaccination.
Right. Which is a misconception about the flu. You talk to a lot of people each year who say, I got the flu shot this year and it gave me the flu. Well, obviously that's impossible.
That's not possible, but what is possible is to perceive that, because
right.
If you got the flu shot, it was probably flu season,
yeah.
And getting the shot for the first couple of days doesn't prevent you from getting hit by a car or by getting flu. So, put yourself in that position. It's easy to misunderstand that. Somebody's going to get a heart attack on Thursday. Getting them vaccinated on Tuesday is not going to save their life. It's just not going to.
Yeah.
So the first vaccines to roll out are amazing science. We are now using this messenger RNA, the ability to send messages into the cells to produce proteins that the body will then recognize as an alien species, as something to get rid of. And then the body's immune system is rallied, and by rallying it against these crazy proteins you've made, you simultaneously rally it against COVID.
So it's like holding up a wanted poster. If you see this virus,
exactly,
go after them.
Exactly. These are computer codes that make wanted posters inside your cells. That's bingo. That's exactly what it is. And it's amazing. It's also amazing because once you've taken these 2 doses of these mRNA vaccines, and you need to get a booster, we'll be able, if there are new variants, to get boosters of mRNA vaccines and to make those boosters very quickly. So all the anxiety that so many of my friends have about the variants is probably well deserved, but we have our own countermeasure in being able to do boosters every year, every 6 months, every 2 years, whatever will be required. The next batch of vaccines that are coming on board, the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, for example, the AstraZeneca vaccine, they are made in a different way. They take a kind of friendly virus that we all have had, a cold virus, an adenovirus, and they hijack it, and they stick in it, or they coat on top of it proteins that again will make the body wake up and build an immune system against those proteins, which happen to be the same proteins that are in the virus for COVID. So those work a little different. I don't think they'll ever be as effective at the 95, 99% level, because the body already is familiar with those adenoviruses, already has some immunity, won't take them as seriously. But they're very safe, and it's easier to make them. You can make them more quickly, and they will be available soon in the billions. So this is several other different kinds of vaccines. But the rigorous process that they've gone through, in most cases, 30,000 people have gone through a test. And by now, millions of people have had the mRNA vaccine, and
Right.
it's doing pretty well.
So that's sort of a misconception that people have about vaccine. A new vaccine like this in general is that, well, I don't want to be the first. Well, you're not the first, because by the time it is even released, as you just said, you've had 30,000 people who have been through the process. They're all okay, and they're resistant to COVID. So, is there a percentage of people who, in this country at least, who need, or let's say around the world, who need to take the vaccine in order for us to have a shot at eradicating this virus? And that obviously includes mask wearing and the things that we have to do in the immediate future before this thing calms down.
So, first of all, I do want to mention that there's always going to be some side effects.
Mm-hmm.
And there's always going to be some proportion of people who get really, really sick. In smallpox, as good as that vaccine was, as much as it liberated us from one of the worst diseases in the world, about 1 out of 1 million or 1 out of 2 million people who got it died. So it wasn't completely harmless, but it was 99.999%
Right.
harmless. So just to put that in perspective,
And a hell of a lot less dangerous than the disease itself.
Hell of a lot less dangerous than the disease. And there's a French expression, to live is to choose. Mm-hmm. And you have to choose to be healthy, or else you're going to be vulnerable. So you're asking what percent of people would need to get vaccinated in order to eradicate. You can't eradicate COVID,
or at least
unfortunately, because it lives in minks and,
yeah.
Forgive me, you mentioned your cat. It does live in some cats, but mostly these are bigger cats, tigers and lions and zoos. Right. So far.
My cat's pretty overweight, so I don't know.
Oh, I'd be worried. It's a risk factor. But I would say that we use this term herd immunity. We're thinking about wildebeest, and you're thinking about if you have a lot of wildebeest around you, you can go through where there are cheetahs, and the cheetah is going to get a different one of the wildebeest, and so you'll have herd immunity. It is something that is aspirational. For those who are interested in math, it's like an asymptote. It's like the Greek legend of Tantalus, who's stuck in a pit and keeps reaching for this bunch of grapes. He's so hungry, and some terrible person keeps pulling him further and further away. Herd immunity is a bit like that. But we have a mathematical formula that links the number of people who need to be vaccinated to stop the disease from spreading to the transmissibility of the disease. And why that's important is because as these new, more transmissible, easier to spread, easier to catch variants come, it raises the level of what percent of people need to be vaccinated in order to stop the spread. And right now we're probably at about 80%. So 80% of 330 million people in the United States, or 80% of over 7 billion people in the world. And if you think about it on the world level, if you're looking at 5 billion or 6 billion people who have to be immunized, each one getting 2 vaccinations, you're talking about producing 10 or 12 billion doses. Even if it's just one dose, you're talking about 5, 6, or 7 billion doses. We've never done anything like this, Seth. This will be the largest vaccination campaign in history. It's the largest public health campaign in history. It will require cooperation of 200 countries. Of course, we need the World Health Organization and all these other organizations and CDC to work together. Of course, we have to figure out how to work with people that we think of our competitors, even enemies. We have to find out how to do that. And in the United States, we're going to have to figure out how to vaccinate 200, 250, 270, maybe as many as 300 million people in order to stop this thing.
So to have a world, a unified global effort to do this starts with obviously a unified national effort to do this. You can't leave everything up to the individual states. There has to be a federal plan, which obviously is hopefully that's what we'll have at this point. we've been lacking a little bit. Is there any? Here's a question that people ask often: is there a difference between the Moderna vaccine and the Pfizer vaccine, or should I take both and let them fight it out in my body?
I don't think there's much of a difference between the two. They're very similar. They use the same technique. They may have a slightly different color of that sign that you mentioned, the wanted sign here. I went in and I said, give me whichever one you have.
Right.
I think the Moderna probably has a slightly higher effectiveness, but one is 3 weeks, the other's almost 4 weeks in between them. No, I would take the one that's available to you the soonest, and the second dose I would get the same one as the first. CDC has now put out guidance that if you're stuck on a desert island and the only vaccine you can get for your second dose is the Moderna and you had the Pfizer or vice versa, you can do it. But we're not usually stuck on a desert island with only one vaccine to choose from.
Right. So are we still seeing a spike? Are we doing better than we were a few months ago? Are we back to more of a March situation? Obviously, we saw a huge spike after the holidays, particularly here in LA. Are we starting to see a plateau, or should we feel good, or should we be careful about getting overconfident?
Both at the same time. This is what pandemics do to you. They really mess you up. You should feel better and worse at the same time. So, these great big national holidays in the United States, whether it's the 4th of July or Memorial Day or Thanksgiving or Christmas or New Year's, they're the greatest spreader of the virus. And so we had 3 of them in a row. We had Thanksgiving, and we had Christmas and New Year's. And we're also in the winter season where we all tend to stay inside and huddle together to stay warm, historically. And so we got the biggest spike of all. We predicted, all the epidemiologists predicted back in October that not only would this be the biggest acceleration of the virus, but because it begins at the highest base of cases, it would be the highest peak, at least for a while. And that's exactly, the virus didn't disappoint us. It followed that pattern. And we had astronomical numbers, as many as 5,000 deaths. We had hundreds of thousands of cases each day. I mean, the hospitals have had, 99% occupancy, 120,000 people in the hospital each day. ICUs had 1 or 2 or 3% vacancies. So now we're beginning to see a decrease in the cases, the number of new cases each day. California is down a third, at least, in new cases. The United States is pretty close as a whole. So we should take a little comfort in the fact that what we've been doing, the combination of masks and social distancing, testing, tracing, and isolation, and the vaccine are beginning to have a little effect. Case counts are going down. However, and this is where it gets confusing, death rates are not going down because, sadly, most people, they get the disease. Some are well, some are not so well. Some have to go to the hospital. Some wind up in an ICU, and unfortunately, some die. So those lag by 2, 4, 6, 8 weeks, the case count. So the case count is going to continue to go down for a while. The death count, unfortunately, is going up still, or is plateauing. So we will wind up with over 500,000 or over 600,000 Americans dying of this disease by April. And if you think about that, that's 600,000 is a magic number. That's the number who died in 1918. So more people will die from COVID than from that great influenza epidemic. But as far as the cases go, they'll go down for a while, and then one of two things will happen, and I can't predict which. Either the same wild type virus that we've had for a year will be the predominant strain, or these new variants, especially the one in the UK, will become the dominant virus. And they're almost the same virus, except they're almost totally different. And the way in which they're totally different is the UK virus is at least 1.5 times as infectious. What happened in
so what does that mean? So it means it takes, if you're at the same gathering with the same person, having the same conversation, maskless, face to face, it's probably going to take you a fraction of the time to get infected.
Yeah, either a fraction of the time to get infected, or if there's 10 of you and 3 were going to get infected with the original strain, now 5 of you will get infected with the new one. You can do the same thing with number of feet that you are away. That's exactly what it means. It means you need a smaller dose, perhaps, of the virus, or a shorter time of exposure. And what the effect of that is, what it was in the UK, was this strain just began, 1 or 2 people got it, and then all of a sudden it began to replace the original COVID virus. And then the hospitalizations began to increase, the deaths began to increase. And what happened in the UK is very quickly 60-70% of all the cases were this new strain, and the hospitals were overrun, and the health system almost cracked under the weight. That's what we're worried about. We're not worried that the new strain, that 100 people who get the new strain, more people will die of those 100 than with the original strain.
Yeah.
The virus is not more lethal just because it creates more cases.
Yeah.
Pro rata, you have a lot more deaths and a lot more hospitalizations.
Well, that's something that's oftentimes, I think, missed in the outside world, is that we look around and we say, well, I don't know anyone who's had COVID. Well, this person is fine. They weren't that sick. But we don't see what goes on inside the hospitals and the chaos. And, certainly one of the issues that came up when with returning to work in Hollywood was when all these cases were going through the roof was not so much we're worried about what happens if someone gets COVID on set. That is a concern. But what if somebody trips and falls and breaks their leg? There's no room to go to the hospital.
Yeah.
And so whether you think it affects you or not, whether you're seeing the manifestations of these numbers in your neighborhood, they can sneak up on you in a way that you're not expecting. But you said something earlier that it's worth going back to just to kind of drive the point home, because I'm seeing some questions in the feed here about, people are saying, well, gosh, if with all these new variants, doesn't that nullify the vaccine? But the way this mRNA works is really novel, is it not? I mean, it's almost like changing, not this simple, but changing the security code on your phone. Is that you when the new strain comes along, the brilliance of this new technology and new medicines, new technology are always scary, but it's pretty miraculous that you're literally just changing the code, are you not?
Yeah, I mean, it's very much like that. I mean, I think that of the new strains, and by the way, WHO now has a special community that work only on what they call VOCs, which is the variants of concern. Mm-hmm. We've had 1,000 variants. 100 of them, we've deconstructed their genome, and of those 100, about 5 are variants of concern. About half a dozen are variants of concern. And the UK variant, and WHO is going to have a new naming system. We're not going to name these viruses any longer by the suspected place of origin. We're usually wrong about that anyway. But the UK variant and the Brazilian variant don't seem to affect the vaccines at all, almost, a little bit maybe. But maybe the South African variant does seem to affect the vaccines, but not in a way that any of us would feel it. I mean, instead of the vaccine being 99.9% or 95.5% effective, maybe it goes down to 70. But the world has worked really well with vaccines that were 50% effective. We got rid of Ebola using ring vaccination with a vaccine that was only 50% effective.
Which you used during the smallpox epidemic.
That's how we got rid of smallpox, through ring vaccination, through vaccinating people who had been exposed to the disease and their contacts, instead of vaccinating, different communities like people who are older or high at risk, but maybe farther away from that immediate transmission. So I'm not worried yet. Here's how I'd say it, Seth. Today's vaccines will handle today's variants. Mm-hmm. I don't know what tomorrow's variants are going to look like. I'm confident there'll be a lot more of them, and we should buckle up. Those will be coming down the pike. So it's an arms race. Fortunately, we have like James Bond. I hate to say Q, but we had a really cool guy in the James Bond stories who was always able to come up with the better weapons, and we're really good at coming up with better weapons against the vaccine, against the virus.
Yeah. Now, are there? Okay, this is a good question. We now have access to more tests, but we're seeing a lot of false positives and false negatives. I know there's been a few questions here. False positives, I guess, is a good thing to talk about. I'm seeing a few questions in the feed. A lot more false positives recently than we have in the past.
Yeah, I would say that the test that we use and rely on, the gold standard test, is really, really sensitive. Mm-hmm. And we had some lab issues where they had old samples lying around, and maybe those samples had just been touching the table or something for a few minutes, and the test could pick that up days later. They weren't picking up live virus. They weren't picking up infectious virus. They were picking up the shadow of virus, the detritus, flotsam and jetsam of dead virus. And these tests, PCR tests can pick up flotsam and jetsam, not real live virus. So you have to be careful. It is a very small percent of false positives, but it's probably 2 or 3 or 4% that are false positives. And if that's the case, we have a simple way of finding out. You just do another test.
Yeah.
And if the next test is negative, then you got, a split decision. So you'll probably want to have a third test. But if you've got 2 negative tests, then the first one was a false positive. It's not quite the same with the antigen tests, which have a very high percentage of false positives. So you have to be very careful about that.
So obviously, since the beginning, we've seen that this disease has been very erratic in its manifestation as far as how it affects people. It can go from killing one person to not even showing symptoms in another, and in a third person, you could perhaps see an example of this long haul syndrome, where it just goes on and on and on. Is there any recent science since all this began that sheds any kind of light on why there's so much variation here?
There is. Seth, this is the part of the virus that surprised me the most. The epidemiology of the virus, the way it spread, the transmissibility, that didn't surprise me or any of the other epidemiologists who've been talking about pandemics for decades. But we use this word pathogenesis to mean the course of the virus and the course of the disease caused by it. That has surprised me a lot. We all talked ourselves into this being a respiratory disease. And that's accurate if you want to describe the method of transmission. It's I don't know if it's 90, 95% respiratory and 1 or 2%, books and desks and things like that, and maybe a small amount that are transmitted other ways. But for the most part, in order to get this virus, you breathe each other's air. It is a respiratory disease. So we think immediately about flu. We think about that as another respiratory. We forget that measles is a respiratory disease. Chickenpox can be a respiratory disease. Smallpox was a respiratory disease. And in smallpox, we didn't have any trouble thinking, this is a system-wide disease. It's going to affect every cell. It can affect your nose to your toes. COVID affects literally your nose to your toes. You get COVID toes, swollen blue toes, and you lose your smell. Smallpox affected nose to toes. It affected every organ. But we didn't think of it as restricted to being a respiratory disease. All of us, in anticipating this pandemic, thought it would be a disease that would cause pneumonia, that people who got sick would have their lungs shot, or they'd wind up in a hospital. If they died, they would die from pneumonia. This disease is not like that, and I saw a cat tail behind me.
Yeah.
At least I hope that was a cat tail.
There is a cat. I hope she doesn't have COVID.
I hope she's not an alien cat, from some of the planets in the orbit.
Sometimes I wonder.
So the surprise, I think, is that there's two phases to COVID. To make it simple, I think. The first is this respiratory phase, where the virus attacks these ACE2 receptors, the receptors that are mostly all over the endothelial cells. So you do wind up with that awful pneumonia that you've seen maybe x-rays of. That's the first phase. But the second phase appears to be a vasculitis, where all the blood vessels in the body might be infected, or affected rather. And when they're affected, they swell up. You're able to get little blood clots all over the body. So every organ can be affected by that, or by a kind of autoimmune response, where later on the virus is gone, you're not contagious. You know, as far as that disease, you're finished with it. But over a period of days or weeks or months, you continue to get the long haul syndrome that either come from an autoimmune disease-esque or come from this vascular disease. And we didn't think about that when we were talking about what would a pandemic look like that was respiratory. That's the biggest surprise. Science is really coming on board now. We're beginning to understand what happens. We understand now how the blocking of these receptor cells can affect everything else. But we're just learning. This is a work in progress. Stay tuned. We're beginning to get better treatments for this. I'm sorry that we didn't have them over the previous year, but we are getting better and better science coming on board.
Well, and that's a let me find the question here, because are there significant changes that this new administration is doing now that are you're hopeful that will accelerate the process? Are there any aspects of their COVID plan you think they're still overlooking? Can we expect any kind of a big improvement?
You're joking, aren't you?
I'm trying to be as fair as possible, but I'm not doing a very good job. I'm trying to do this with a straight face. How do you think?
I mean, to begin with, you know,
now that we're using science instead of our gut,
you can't solve a problem unless you name it and count it and take it seriously.
Yeah.
You can't solve a problem if you ignore it.
Right.
And it's like ignoring metastatic cancer. It doesn't go away by itself. We joke about it. It's not a joke to ignore this and pretend it'll go away. The Biden administration has some of the best scientists in the world. The task force or the community that are advising the new president are the best epidemiologists in the world. CDC is repopulated and led by some of the best scientists in the world. The administration is being led by scientists. They're doing it in a more equitable way. They're taking into account all the things I would want them to. So I'm so much more confident. I was really worried. I was worried that not only were we failing to lead the world look, let's just take a step back. Every epidemic in the world has been led by American science coming out of CDC and NIH. That's how we eradicated smallpox and polio. That's how we led in Zika and Ebola. The world depends upon NIH for most of the basic science. Very few countries have anything close to NIH. CDC is name stamped all over the world. What is the institute in China that works on this? China CDC. What about in Africa? Africa CDC. How about Europe? European CDC. So we lost these great leading agencies and our leadership position by not taking this disease serious. And worst of all, we gave it a 6-month head start. You don't want to give a virus that multiplies exponentially a 6-month head start. That's not a good idea. So no, I'm so much more confident and comfortable. But as I said earlier, the one thing the Trump administration did really well was to create the urgency, the money, the plan, the funding for these vaccines. So while I'd give them a very bad score in how they dealt with the virus, it's not a net zero, because bequeathing us these vaccines is really a great thing. And I don't know if we'd have got them this fast under other circumstances. So while I'm really mad of many of the things they did by inaction, and I mean, hydroxychloroquine, and putting light into the body and bleach. I mean, all these silly things. Those were big opportunity costs, but it wasn't nothing that was left to us.
Mm-hmm. So the macro message there is that yes, this virus is scary. Yes, it's going to be here a while. Yes, we're going to be fighting it for a while, but we do have the tools to beat it if we embrace the science. I mean, it's Ann Druyan, who I worked with on Cosmos, used to still does point out often that you look at the millennia during which some form of human existed, and we just kind of advanced at a snail's pace, and this went on for tens and hundreds of thousands of years, and now 3 centuries ago, 3-4 centuries ago, here comes the scientific method, and suddenly that snail's pace is accelerated, and we have satellites, we have television sets, we have airplanes, we have computers, we have all this technology because of this amazing thing called the scientific method. So then we can get ourselves out of this with some efficiency. And you're a perfect example. You've done it before using science. So, and even not to scare people, an even more serious pandemic, you could make the argument, is not a matter of if, but of when. But this doesn't have to happen, right? Are there lessons we can take from the failures of this pandemic that we could use to be quicker on the draw for the next one? In an ideal situation, if you're describing it in a GIF, is it SpongeBob SquarePants dancing or Judge Judy rolling her eyes? Basically, where will we be? Where will we be if we embrace the lessons we've learned from this and embrace the science? And where will we be if we do the same thing that we did for the past year?
Well, first of all, we will throw COVID into the dustbin of history.
Yeah.
We may not be able to eradicate it because it's in animals, but we will be able to control it. As I said earlier, countries like Vietnam and South Korea and Taiwan have gone hundreds of days with 0 cases until somebody came in from outside their country without a vaccine. The vaccine helps us immeasurably to get that. So we will throw it into the dustbin of history. But it may take a while. It could take, a number of years. And
let's say we want our future to look like the Orville instead of Mad Max.
No, the future is going to look like the Orville, not like Mad Max. Absolutely, there's no question about that. As long as we don't lose to the Kalons.
Sure. We're always.
But I would say this: people need to understand that animals and humans are living closer and closer in each other's natural territory as we cut down the rainforests, as we're mindless about climate change, as more and more meat, especially of wild animals, are eaten. Last year, 2 billion kilograms of bushmeat was consumed. As we move into places that monkeys and bats have always lived, the viruses that they have will be shared with humans. And every year, 2, 3, 4, 5 bad viruses leap from animals to humans. So what we have to do is have early detection and early response. We have to find them when they leap immediately, when there's still 1 or 2 or 5 cases. It's so much easier to snuff out a forest fire when it's still a match rather than it's a raging fire tornado.
So leaving the World Health Organization was probably not the smartest idea, or not leaving the but being dismissive of the World Health Organization was probably not the wisest thing, because is that not ground zero for the kind of detection you're talking about?
Yes, there's an organization called GORN, which is a terrific organization, part of WHO, the Global Outbreak Response Network. I would say leaving that in the middle of a pandemic, history won't judge that too kindly as a smart move.
Larry, this has been fantastic. I tell you, every time I talk to you, I feel like I'm just a little smarter.
I feel the same way, Seth. It's great to see you. They don't know that we're friends outside of the context of this Instagram square. So it's such a privilege to get to know you and to hang out with you and all your friends from all over the known and unknown universe.
You too, my friend. Thanks so much for doing this. I know we all appreciate it.
Thank you for inviting me.
All right. Have a good day.
Thank you.